All right, so we're gonna share some slides with y'all. I am super excited and thankful to be with you. I really enjoyed our time with the PRISM students beforehand. Just a little bit more. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. My name is Jamie. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a mom of 3. My oldest daughter, 7th grader, is transgender. I am a full-time advocate. I work across the country in schools and workplaces and faith communities, working to create safer and more welcoming spaces for all students. I am a clergy spouse. I share that because I'm married to a Lutheran pastor, and because faith is so often a contentious thing for the LGBTQ community, and quite frankly does a lot of damage to the community. It's an important intersection both in my work and in my personal life, and so it's sometimes something that I can speak to for folks that have questions. I am queer. I am a lifelong New Jerseyan. I am really proud to be a New Jerseyan thanks to the legislative victories we've had in really across history, but especially in the last few years. As far as safety, I know that it would be really unlikely for us to move out of this state because my daughter has rights here that she doesn't have anywhere else, which is a problem, but also really good to live here. And I'm hopeful. The work I do, the work we all do, can be really hard. You know, the world is not always a happy, welcoming place for the LGBTQ community. And that can be really challenging, and sitting and working with students and hearing their stories and trying to walk with them on these journeys is hard. But it's folks like you that have joined us for this afternoon and who show up every day in your classrooms and who want to learn, who give me a lot of hope and energy to continue doing this work. So thank you for being here, and thank you for what you do. I'm just gonna make sure I can't see my chat screen for a second since I got switched to admin. So give me one moment. I wanna make sure. All right. I will check in on questions. Wait, can I see it? Yes, I can, I think. I love technology. Okay. So, there we go. So I'm going to start by just doing a little bit of basics so that we're all on the same page. I know that there are a whole lot of folks joining us today, and that's wonderful, but I also know we all come with a lot of different knowledge and information and background and personal experience, and so I want us to have a shared foundation to go into today with. So first and foremost, you may not know all the terms when it comes to talking about the LGBTQ community in general, and that's okay. I can tell you, I do this full time. I go into all of these places, and I am learning new terms all the time, especially from young people. You don't need to know all the terms to respect people and create safe spaces. Listen to the ways that people describe themselves and the language they use about their identities, and just mirror that language back to them. People get really scared and worried about making mistakes, and I want you to know that first off, you're going to make mistakes. It's just natural, and that's okay. The best thing you can do when someone corrects you or you misstep and someone offers you information is to say thank you and move on. That's really powerful because it doesn't put the responsibility of accepting some drawn out apology or uncomfortable silence that we need to cover up on the person who may be correcting you. Just say thank you, learn from that moment, and move on and do your best. It's far more important that you're willing to step out and do your best to be an ally than to be kind of stuck in that fear and doing nothing as a result of it. Most importantly, we respect self-identification. So I am going to trust that all of you know yourselves better than I could ever know you. And I'm going to expect you to trust that I know myself better than you could know me. And we need to do the same thing with our students. They know themselves better than any of us could. And so we're going to respect their self-identification and trust when they tell us who they are. Sorry, my screen doesn't want to flip. There we go. Okay. So when we talk about the LGBTQ community and gender and sexuality, we often talk about continuums or spectrums, which I'll get to those in a second, but I always start with the curiosity continuum. We often say there is no bad question. And while that's mostly true, it's important to pay attention to where our questions are coming from. And so this is the curiosity continuum, going from hospitable curiosity to lurid curiosity. So hospitable curiosity is when we have questions or we want to know more in order to create a more welcoming space, in order to show up better in relationship with one another. The bullet's question, will this question help me build a relationship of mutual trust and respect? Great. Those are the kinds of questions we really want to pay attention to and lean into. Lurid curiosity, on the other hand, is the reason that we all slow down when we're driving on the highway and there's an accident to see what's happening, even though generally most of us can't do anything. We're not going to stop and help. We just want to know what's happening. It's all about us. Lurid curiosity is about us. It's not about the people we're trying to show up in community with. And so while this is a safe space to ask questions, absolutely, in general in our work and when we're working with students and colleagues, it's really helpful to just think, where's this question coming from, and have that filter before we put it out into the world, or to help someone else who is coming to us with questions walk through and wonder where their question is coming from. Asking people about the details of their bodies or what they do with them is never hospitable. In general, we just don't want to treat people like exotic oddities. So, continuum. We've gone from curiosity, and these are kind of our four main continuum we look at when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity. I'm going to kind of do like the super short version on this, again, just so we're on the same page, but I don't want to take up all of our time with it. There are a few different models to look at this with. You may have seen the gender-bred person, or I really like the gender unicorn, comes out of the Trans Student Educational Resource Organization. But this is a pretty simple one that I tend to start with. So the first one is sex. We have the sex you were assigned at birth. So when a baby is born, we say it's a boy or it's a girl, or we even do that before they're born often. And so we're generally expect that to be you check this box or that box. But even that is a continuum and more complex than we often think about. So there's male and female in the extremes, and in the middle we have folks that are born with intersex bodies. And so intersex bodies have a diverse assortment of either genetics, genetics and chromosomes, or hormones, or external genitalia, or internal reproductive organs. So sometimes when someone is born, we know that they're intersex right from then. It's obvious externally. And sometimes people don't discover they're intersex until they go through puberty, or they try to start a family, or have reproductive challenges. Or sometimes people don't know they're intersex ever in their life. We find it out in an autopsy, or maybe we don't ever find out. It's important to know that that's just a lot more common than we're generally led to believe. Best stat out there is 1 in 100 births is an intersex person. And again, they may not know that at that time. So that is sex assigned at birth in this super quick and quick version. So then we have gender identity. Gender identity is who you know yourself to be. It is a deeply held sense of self. When this aligns with the sex we were assigned at birth, we call that cisgender. So when I was born, everyone said, it's a girl, and I've always known myself to be female, so I'm a cisgender woman. When that doesn't align, when your gender identity is different from the sex you were assigned at birth, then that's transgender. So my daughter, when she was born, everybody said it's a boy, but she deeply knows herself to be a girl. We were just wrong. Gender identity exists on a continuum as well, with man and woman on the extremes, and in the middle we have words like non-binary, genderqueer, two-spirit, agender, gender fluid. There are many, many, many more. It's, again, not important that you know every single one of these identities, but it is important that you know that they are valid identities, and that not everyone fits into these boxes of man or woman or boy or girl. So gender identity is who you know yourself to be. Now, you can't know someone's gender identity unless they tell you. We make a lot of assumptions about people's gender identity based on their gender expression. And so that's the next one. Our gender expression is how we express our gender to the world. It's the way we talk, it's the way we dress, it's the way we walk and move. It's everything about us that we express. And that exists on a continuum from masculine to feminine, with androgynous in that section in the middle. Again, we make assumptions based on that to assume someone's gender identity, but we can't know unless they tell us. Gender expression is kind of fun because it's the most clear one where we can say this can change day to day. You know, there are days where I might be dressed in jeans and a hooded sweatshirt and sneakers and pretty androgynous. And there might be days where I'm going to a fancy event and I've decided to dress up in a fancy dress and heels and pearls. Okay, I don't wear pearls, but you get the idea. I can change the way I express my gender depending on how I'm feeling, what I'm doing, or what I want. My gender identity doesn't change just because my gender expression changed. So that helps us understand that these are all different continuum. Just because you fit in this spot on this continuum doesn't mean anything about where you might fall on the other ones. And then we have the fourth one, sexual orientation. This is totally separate from gender, and that is really important. We conflate them all the time. As the parent of a transgender child who transitioned, who changed her name and pronouns so she could go out in the world as herself at 8 years old, one of the most common questions I got was, what does an 8-year-old know about their sexuality? Well, not very much, to be honest, but this wasn't about her sexual orientation or attraction. It is about who she is, who she knows herself to be, and that is something that we do know from a very young age. So we make assumptions about people's sexual orientation based on their current or past relationships. So just like gender identity, you can't know someone's sexual orientation unless they tell you. So that's like the super, I'm going to check the chat, make sure there's not questions. Okay, and I'm admitting people as we come in. I've got all sorts of host duties here. Do I have suggestions for, yes.
Sorry, Jamie, that you're letting people in about the host thing. I appreciate it. Jamie, I've been collecting the questions in a separate Google Doc, so you don't have to,
Awesome.
read through the chat. I'll let you know when they're coming through.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Sarah. I do you have suggestions for dealing with the lurid curiosity of other students? I would say that sometimes it's about having that conversation. So when we say there's no bad question, that is true. Like, students are going to bring you all sorts of questions. And lurid curiosity doesn't mean it's coming from a bad place. A lot of times it's just that innocent, again, we all stop on the highway to see what's happening. It's a little bit of human nature, but to walk with them to understand privacy and to have ideas of what kind of questions they would answer about their own bodies or identities or anything like that helps a lot. And then there's a place where we tell students all the time, like, this is not something you need to know. And so to create some boundaries of safety around LGBTQ students, to say that that's not an appropriate thing to ask. I'll hold off on any other questions. I'll let Sarah deal with that. Thank you. Okay. So that's like the crash course on some basic terminology. We could spend entire days, weeks on that alone, but just so that we have some basic understanding, especially that gender identity and sexual orientation are different, even though these communities are lumped together under the LGBTQ umbrella. So this is my daughter, Rebecca. She is 13 years old now. She is a 7th grader here in New Jersey. And when she was born, we thought she was a boy. And we walked with her on a journey of her telling us over the course of really years of who she was. But now, as a 7th grader, she is a high achieving student. She gets straight A's. She has great friends. She plays field hockey. She's in theater. She is in the regional band. She does all of these things. All in all, on a day-to-day basis, she's your typical thriving 7th grade girl. That wasn't always the case. So she transitioned at 8 years old. So it'll actually be 5 years in 2 weeks. We're coming up on her anniversary of transitioning. So she transitioned at 8 years old after a period of pretty intense depression and anxiety, which is really hard to kind of wrap your brain around when you have a 7-year-old who doesn't have language for what they're experiencing, but it is clearly in crisis. And in the months prior to that transition, and as we worked through that crisis point, we stumbled into a conversation that would really kind of clarify things and set us on a specific path for her. We were getting ready for my middle kiddo's, who's 2 years younger than Rebecca's, birthday party in the winter, and we were going to have a swim party. Now, this picture is from just a couple months prior to that. Rebecca was at a point where she was wearing all girl clothes. She had always been gender nonconforming, if you will. Her favorite color had been pink from the time she could talk, and we had always said, colors are for everyone, clothes are for everyone, be any kind of boy you want to be. And as we got ready for this swim party, she had this moment where she looked at me and said, oh, like, what am I going to wear? And we realized that since the summer, her wardrobe had significantly changed and she wasn't buying anything from the boys section anymore. And this whole getting into a bathing suit was a big question. And so I took a deep breath and said, well, we can get you a pink rash guard. We can get you pink swim shorts. You can wear a girl's bathing suit, which admittedly as a parent I said, and I tried to sound even, but was a scary thought because we know the world is not always kind to folks that don't fit into the boxes that the world has for them. And as we had this conversation, I said, well, let's just Google gender nonconforming swimsuits because as a parent, if you don't have the answer, Google sometimes does. And so it seemed like the obvious answer. When we did that, there were not options for swimsuits. I can tell you 5 years later, if you do that Google search now, there are more options. But what we did find was some sites that talked about the LGBTQ community. We saw the acronym. And so I looked at her. She had just turned 8 at the time. And I said, oh, do you know what these letters mean? And she said, no, I don't. Now, for some background, our family had always been an affirming one. We had celebrated with our very young children with marriage equality. Our children had always known that love is love and you can marry anyone. In fact, they'd gone toe-to-toe with preschool teachers when my younger son wanted to marry his best friend and the teacher said he couldn't, and Rebecca handled that entirely and was like, no, absolutely, that's not how it works. So like that was our framework, but we'd never come across the acronym LGBT with our young children. And so I went through the letters and I said the L and the G and the B. And when I got to the T, she looked at me and went, oh, maybe that's what I am. And I said, oh, maybe that's what you are. And as parents, we had known this was a possibility. I think we had started to do reading and research and learning about gender identity and gender expression in children and gender creativity and all of these words. And we were being really intentional about not making assumptions about her future gender or sexuality. And so in this moment, when she learned the word transgender, and we came across a video of really young Jazz Jennings, who is a transgender activist, and there's a video of her at like 7 years old talking about being transgender, and Rebecca went, wow. Like there was this moment of being seen and realizing that how she was feeling and who she knew herself to be was a thing. I mean, for lack of a better word, there was a community out there. There were people like her. And so while learning the word did not make her trans in any way, shape, or form, learning the language and connecting to the community helped her see a future for herself and see possibility for who she had struggled with knowing she was. And so it was 6 weeks later from that date that she learned the word transgender that she went out into the world as herself for the first time. And so it happened pretty quickly. We were, everything just fell into place. As she'd learned this word, we sought out a gender therapist, we talked through all these things, and we just tried to keep up following her lead. And as parents, we held our breath. I mean, there was a lot of fear. There was also solace in knowing, like, okay, we're changing her name and her pronouns. We can change it back tomorrow if this isn't what we should be doing. And so we took this leap with her, and it became very clear immediately that this is who she was. She was happy. She was just bright and shining, and the light in her exploded all over. She was no longer having to pretend she was someone she wasn't. And the residual anxiety and depression that we'd been dealing with and trying to treat in all of the ways that you try to treat those things was just gone. She was thriving. And so in that moment, we were like, okay, this is who she is. We're on this journey. And it has been an adventure ever since. Oh, that's not where we're going yet. That's okay. So shortly after that, 5 months after that, she entered the public school system for the first time. We had been in a tiny Montessori school, and then we were just not in a good fit there anymore. And so we had taken a year off and homeschooled, which had never been my plan, but it ended up working out really well because it gave her space as she transitioned. And so as we got ready for the school year in September, we decided to put her into public school, and I showed up in the school office with a packet of papers this thick and said, I need a meeting with the principal and I need him to read this first. Now, this was 5 years ago, and it's kind of amazing how far we've come in 5 years. Obviously, we have more work and learning to do, but even on a state level, there are so many more resources, there is more guidance, there's more information, and our schools are further ahead than we were 5 years ago. And so we were really lucky that our school district learned with us. They listened to us. They did the research. They saw Rebecca, and she started school as herself. It was unique for us because she got to enter school as herself. We'd lived in the same town, so there were a few people here that knew that she had transitioned, but for the most part, her community just knew her as Rebecca. So like no one in her class had known her before this day. Her teachers were aware, we'd communicated with them, but she got to go in and just be her, which was a beautiful, beautiful gift. And then we saw that over time, as she got close to people, she wanted to tell them. This was a part of who she was. It wasn't a secret that she wanted to hide, and she wanted to be able to share it with her friends and with her classmates. And so the one day she came home from school and she was like, oh, I told Lily that I'm trans at school today. And I said, you did what? And I mean, I was terrified. I had no idea how that would go or what. And she quickly said, don't worry, Mom. She didn't believe me. And they said, oh, of course, that makes sense. And so we got to have the unique challenge of communicating with other parents and sending storybooks home to help them learn and understand, and following Rebecca's lead as far as how she wanted to share. Lily, that girl, didn't believe her once we gave her a book, talked to her mom. She said, oh, okay, cool, and it was no big deal. On the other hand, sometimes she would tell young kids, so they were in 3rd grade at this time, and the response was less than good. It was, oh, that's disgusting. And that was pretty hurtful for Rebecca. I think young kids that hear these words that they don't have information about can get scared, can get reactive. And so we saw how that play out very differently depending on the families that young kids came from and what experience they'd had with the trans community before this. So that was a really important learning opportunity, both in that language she learned before she transitioned, and then as we talked to other classmates about what that means, about the importance of young kids. I mean, she was 8, 3rd grade, understanding that the LGBTQ community exists. Like, these aren't dirty words. They're not secrets. This is all G-rated information. Some families have 2 moms, and some kids we thought were boys but are actually girls. This is not scandalous. And so that became something that was really important to us to try to help articulate to folks in our communities. We stumbled into public advocacy and awareness a couple of years ago, 3, when the federal administration rescinded the guidance for transgender students in schools. And it was a scary moment. It was teachers and students across the country were really unclear about what that meant. In New Jersey, we had really great legislation. Our law against discrimination truly protected trans students, but students and educators didn't know that. And so there was this confusing messaging. I'd been doing some educating and speaking on my own, so I'd offered to speak at a rally in Jersey City with Garden State Equality and Jersey City Stands. And the person that I spoke to said, "Oh yeah, you and Rebecca can talk." And I was like, "What? She's 10. But I asked her, and she said absolutely. She wanted to share her story and explain why all students deserve access to safe and affirming schools. Schools like she had experienced largely. And so at that event, she had that sign that said, "I'm the scary transgender person the media warned you about." And that kind of went crazy viral. And in that moment, we were given a platform that we had never anticipated. She really was given a platform. I mean, she was coming home from school and we were getting interview requests, and I'd be like, "Oh, it's Teen Vogue today," or "It's Huffington Post today," or whatever. Very surreal with a 10-year-old. But Rebecca was adamant that having heard the other stories shared that day, stories that weren't as happy or as supported as hers is, that she wanted to use her voice to make whatever difference she could. And that's been a really important experience for her. What we've seen is in that moment, there's this, nobody owes anyone else their identity, their story, that information. You come out to people when you want to, when you're ready to, that's yours. And yet, Rebecca didn't want to keep it to herself. She felt stuck in this place where, is this a secret I have to hide? Or is this something I can share on my own terms? And so advocacy was an opportunity for her to really realize that her trans identity could be a source of empowerment and a way for her to make really positive change in the world. She works closely with Garden State Equality, has over the years. There's Ashley from GSA. And it's been really powerful for her confidence and the way she sees her identity as a transgender young person. That being said, it has also brought a lot of hate. And so while our support had really shielded her from a lot of the negative experiences that trans young people and LGBT young people as a whole have, advocacy broke through that shield a lot. I mean, we still wildly protect her, but she's much more aware of what's out in the world, both through other people's stories and from the feedback we get, which I don't really need to go into. But all that being said, it's important to understand that as much support as she has received, she still finds it hard. She finds it hard for all sorts of reasons. She navigates all the things that other LGBTQ young people get. Go back. Dang it. There we go. There are a lot of struggles. And so she has a lot of privilege and a lot of protection, and she still struggles. And we know that young people that don't have that privilege and protection struggle even more. And so some of those struggles are debilitating rates of anxiety and depression, access to affirming healthcare, family support is a massive one, faith struggles, school support, homelessness, violence, access to affirming athletics, bullying, legal barriers. One of the things we were told when Rebecca first transitioned was that we needed to create a safe folder. A folder of documents that attested to her good health and well-being, pictures of her gender nonconformity along the years, her self-portraits she had drawn, basically to say that we were not forcing this on her in the case that we were reported to DCPMP for child abuse. We thought that was unlikely, but we did what we were told to do, and we were really glad when eventually we were reported. Mostly for us due to our very public advocacy. And yet I know other families in New Jersey, throughout New Jersey, who have been reported by family members and neighbors or teachers who decided that this was some sort of form of abuse. Now, to be clear, New Jersey DCPMP, the Division of Child Protection and Permanency, is very clear that supporting your transgender child is not abuse. In fact, not affirming your child is. But we still had to go through that process of, having them come into our homes, of Rebecca basically having to defend her identity there, which is traumatic to say the very least. And again, this is someone with a lot of protection, a lot of safety. Legal things, we've changed her name legally. We've been able to access those resources and go through the court system. We have access to healthcare. We drive to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for her gender affirming care. Again, there's a lot of privilege in us being able to do that, having insurance that covers it, and all of those things. So as we kind of pull back from Rebecca specifically and look more at LGBTQ youth as a whole, what we see is that 77% of LGBTQ youth reported feeling depressed or down over the past week in the Human Rights Campaign's 2018 LGBTQ youth report. With the Trevor Project data out of 2019, 39% of LGBTQ youth said they have seriously considered suicide in the past 12 months. If we look at other data on anxiety and suicidality and other mental health statistics, we see that they're really not good for LGBTQ youth. And there's a really dangerous thing that can happen here. We hear people say, well, look, there must be something wrong with them. Look, they are so anxious and depressed, clearly they need to be fixed. And that is, I hope, obviously not the case. LGBTQ youths don't struggle because there is something wrong with them. They struggle because of the society they live in, sometimes because of the families they live in, because of the schools they attend, because of what they experience from their peers. And that becomes really clear when we look at more data. Only 5% of LGBTQ students say that all of their teachers and staff are supportive of LGBTQ people. Only 5%. Now, as educators, I'm sure you're like, well, they might not know, they might not, I would never said anything bad. But here's the thing, if you've never said anything bad, but you've never said consistent things positive about the LGBTQ community, students don't know. And so 95% of students are going through their days trying to figure out who is safe. Can I talk to this person? Can I be my full self in this class? Can I write about this topic in this language arts class? They are constantly looking for clues to decide if this is a safe place to be and if you're a safe person. That's incredibly anxiety producing. 67% of LGBTQ youth hear their families make negative comments about LGBTQ people. 67%. That's a lot, and that includes kids that are out. So some of these families know that their kids are queer and are saying negative things about it. That's a significant struggle to deal with your identity being something that is being rejected by the people you care about most and who are supposed to love you unconditionally. 73% of LGBTQ youth have experienced verbal threats because of their actual or perceived identity. And 76% of LGBTQ youth felt that the recent political climate impacted their mental health or sense of self. I don't care about your personal political beliefs, but I need you to know that every day LGBTQ youth are absorbing the messages around them. They're being used as a political football. They are scared, and they are certainly not oblivious to it. And so again, regardless of your political beliefs, I need you to understand the weight that LGBTQ young people are carrying every single day. And we talk about homelessness. 40% of unaccompanied homeless youth are LGBT, which is compared to 5 to 10% of the general population. And the number one reason they're on the streets is family rejection. Most often, these young people have gone through the foster care system, so they have been, by definition, experienced abuse and neglect, been placed in the care system, where they are twice as likely as non-LGBTQ young people are to experience mistreatment, abuse, and neglect, and have decided that they are safer on the streets. So they've been failed first by their family of origin and then by our system. That should be devastating to all of us as human beings, as teachers, educators, parents. Those are pretty big numbers. Now, often we hear, again, but we could just fix them. Like if we just made them not queer, then none of this would be a problem. And 2 in 3 LGBTQ youth do experience attempts to change their gender or sexuality. Except data shows that not only does this not work, it also more than doubles their suicide risk. So rejection and attempts to convert them don't work, but we know what does: support. We heard it from the students in PRISM that were sharing prior to this conversation. Support is the #1 mitigating factor for all of these risks. LGBTQ youth who reported having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt. One adult equates to 40% reduction in suicide attempts. That's huge. What if we can give them entire schools, entire communities, entire families, all of these things, but just one adult? Because it can feel really daunting to be like, well, I don't know that I can get our entire school to be a safe and supportive person, but just one adult goes a long way. Similarly, if we look at transgender young people, this is data out of the University of Washington's Trans Youth Project, and it's the first longitudinal study that's following transgender young people as they grow. My daughter's one of the study participants, and what they found, this is transgender young people who are supported in their identities. They are affirmed and allowed to be who they say they are, who they know they are. We see that rates of depression, so we've got depression in the green line, or depression up here. We have the transgender study participant in the green, the cisgender control, so someone the same age that is not transgender, and then the siblings are here in the yellow, that depression and anxiety rates are comparable to that of their cisgender siblings and peers. There is a statistically relevant uptick in anxiety, although it is still minor compared to the rates we see without affirmation. But also that's completely understandable considering everything else I just said about what they experience in their day-to-day lives. So support 100% saves lives. So what does support look like? Support looks like creating spaces for kids to be themselves. And I say kids, but I mean all K-12 students. And those spaces mean spaces that are really looking at, we heard from the PRISM students, like don't separate between boys and girls. Don't put gendered expectations on our young people. Breaking down the boxes that we want to put students in all the time is critical. Affirmation. Affirmation means trusting that when young people say this is who they are, it is who they are, and supporting them, telling them that you see them and you support them. And then we have representation. So representation is so critical. Representation matters. It's about the stories that they see around them. If we go back to Rebecca, when she was articulating who she was, it was seeing someone else. It was seeing little Jazz Jennings talk about her identity that made Rebecca feel safe enough, courageous enough, ready to say, this is who I am. Representation also matters in those stories that I shared about how her peers respond to finding out about her, finding out that she happens to be transgender when they weren't aware of it before. Kids with no exposure or no understanding, who have seen no positive representation of other LGBTQ people, respond negatively, where those with some sort of frame of reference are much more likely to be positive. So that leads us to our LGBTQ inclusive curriculum law, which is really exciting. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more with Kate and Allison in a bit. Rebecca was one of the people who testified at the Assembly Education hearing in favor of this bill. And it was really important to her to raise her voice on that. And I want to just share part of what she said that day for you all to understand that as you go about trying to implement new content and shifts to what you're already doing. Again, it's not having you teach more, and Kate and Allison can explain that more, but shifting the way we do some of our teaching, why this is so important from a student's perspective. Rebecca said, I love learning about the history of our country in school. I have learned about immigrants and the Great Migration, the Louisiana Purchase, brave soldiers and founding fathers. I've learned about the branches of government, the Bill of Rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment. Every year we learn about September 11th. I've learned about all this stuff, but I never see myself in the history they are teaching. I've never heard the word transgender even mentioned in my history books. I don't learn about advocates like me standing up for LGBTQ rights. I wish my school was teaching me and my peers about things like Harvey Milk and the Pride Flag, Marsha P. Johnson and the Stonewall Riots, about the fight for marriage equality. I wish my school was teaching about the ways LGBTQ people have stood in the face of adversity and fought for equality so that kids like me could have the life I have. I want my school to teach students about LGBTQ people so my classmates can understand and be more accepting of others. Most of the kids probably don't even know what the word transgender means. Some even think it's a bad word. Learning about people who are different than us makes us better human beings, better friends, and better classmates. This means less bullying, safer schools, which means healthier kids, better grades, and improved test scores. She said more than that, but that really gets to the heart of what we're doing and what we're talking about. To that end, I also want to share, before I jump into questions, of which I think there are many, our family was really lucky to be a part of a project called Marvel's Hero Project. It's a series streaming on Disney Plus that looks at 20 kids across the country making positive differences in their communities. And Rebecca was one of those kids. And it actually talks a lot about our new curriculum bill and includes her testifying at the State House that day and explains why it's important. They also, she's an official Marvel superhero, which is super fun too. And she has her own comic book. The comic's available. You can read it online. And the episode is streaming. I share it because I've seen teachers, especially family members and community organizations and faith communities, but especially teachers and educators using this in their classrooms. It's Disney, it's Marvel, it's accessible, it's kid-friendly. I've shown it at middle schools and high schools as a kind of jumping off point to have conversations with students about what this means and why this is important. About what it means to be trans. And so when we talk about representation, this was such an important step, a beautiful opportunity for young people to see themselves represented by such big companies, but it's also really cool that it took this unique point in New Jersey history of this particular law and what it's meaning for our schools and really dives deep into it. So I wanted to share that as a resource. I'm going to now stop my screen share. I think that's my last slide, but I'm sure. Yep, stop my screen share, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Sarah, do you have those? Do you want to offer them to me? I do. Is that easiest?
The one that kept coming up, Jamie, was what are Rebecca's pronouns?
Rebecca's pronouns are she and her.
Thank you. Yes. They were trying to reference Rebecca in the chat and they wanted to use the correct pronouns.
I love that. Yeah. So I pretty consistently I really only use she for her. She for her, huh? Even when I talk about Rebecca in the past, when we thought she was a boy, I always use female pronouns and her affirmed name because this is who we know she is. We were just confused before. So you'll notice I don't go back and forth. And that's really important because using the wrong name or pronouns or the birth name and birth pronouns of a transgender person can be really painful for them and can cause a lot of trauma. And so even if we're talking about them in the past, when they went by a different name or pronouns, we always use the language that they've asked us to use now.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Our first question is, can you please explain sexual orientation again?
Absolutely. So sexual orientation is generally who you're attracted to. The really simple way, sometimes they're like, gender is who you spend your life as, whereas sexual orientation might be who you want to spend your life with. A little oversimplified, certainly, but it's the idea that it's who you're attracted to, who you want to be in relationship with in that way. And it exists on a continuum from attracted to male or females, or in the middle we have words like bisexual, pansexual, asexual. So you can be attracted to a variety of genders, all genders, no genders, whatever that may be.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Our next question is, how did you communicate this in the school? I believe what they're referencing is the name change and who your daughter is.
Yeah, so we were in a unique place where we, because she happened to have been homeschooled when she transitioned, when we registered her for school, we registered her as Rebecca. Now, her name had not been legally changed at that point, and so we talked to our administration and said, this is really important, this is her name, and in accordance with the guidelines that now exist from the New Jersey Department of Education that didn't then, they made sure that her name was correct in every place, in all official documentation, and kept her birth certificate and her legal name at that time locked away in their files where it needed to be, but confidential. And so in all of the systems, she was Rebecca.
Great, yeah. Thank you. All right. Our next question is, can you explain gender affirming care?
Yeah, I think I used that term when I was talking about healthcare. And so gender affirming care really, it means two different things. We can use the term gender affirming care when we're talking about transition related care. So at some point, young people may access medical transition opportunities. And that's a little bit of a choose your own adventure. That doesn't look the same for all people, both because of personal choice, access, and health related concerns. And that doesn't happen with young children. It's important that we all know that young children are not medically transitioning. When Rebecca transitioned, it was a social transition. She changed her name and pronouns. That was it. But eventually, as she entered puberty, she has access to puberty blocking medication that prevents her going through the puberty that she was assigned at birth, and eventually she'll have access to cross hormones. So that's transition-related care. But there's also just affirming care in general. So she needs to be able to go to a doctor that's going to use her affirmed name and her affirmed pronouns and be appropriate and supportive of who she is. And so it can be like your primary care provider you need to make sure is a supportive person, which is a challenge sometimes, but also it's about seeking emergent care. So I took her to urgent care once because I knew she had strep throat. I could just tell, we were after hours. And we ended up with this whole thing. They asked about a medication. She has this hormone blocking implant, explained she was trans, and they were like, oh, she wants to be a boy? Well, what's the code for that? I'm like, no, she is a girl. She was assigned male at birth. I don't know the medical code. Can you just test her for strep? And so people get really confused. And that was someone who was not being malicious. They weren't being harmful on purpose. They were just uneducated. Sometimes you get people where trans people experience real mistreatment intentionally from medical providers. So affirming medical care is a pretty wide spectrum and can be a big source of struggle for families.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry if we're rushing through these questions, Jamie. You can tell me to slow down, or if you...
Oh, you're fine. Sorry, I'm talking fast. I hope people can keep up.
Very fast, so no worries there. Our next question is, Jamie, did your child's decision initiate your advocacy?
Yes, absolutely. So I had always considered myself an ally. And yet when it becomes your life and your own kid, that changes everything. And so we found that we were just automatically advocating within our family and then the school, and our circles just kept getting wider and wider until suddenly we were doing this on a very public scale. I also personally came out as queer myself because of my advocacy journey with her and in choosing to take up that space and share my own story.
Thank you for sharing that about yourself. Jamie, our next question is, how can we make schools more inclusive for trans educators as well as students?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, we could have a day-long or week-long seminar on that alone, but I think It's really important to have affirming policies in place. It's a really great place to start with the New Jersey Department of Education guidance on transgender students, which is a really student-centered approach and is pretty thorough. So if you're not familiar with that, if your school doesn't have a policy that is in alignment with that, that is where I would tell you to start. I think beyond that, representation in curriculum, like we're going to talk about more in a little bit, but also just in your spaces, like knowing that LGBTQ and that transgender are not R-rated words. They're G-rated, they're normal, that this is an accepted thing. I talked about how students are going through their days looking for those signs of, is this a safe place? And so that's where you talk about things like safe space stickers, or making sure that you have a club, a GSA or a QSA. Just having a club like a GSA reduces suicide rates for all students, not even LGBTQ students, all of them, which is incredible to understand because of what it does to the climate, because what it means to a school to have done that work. And so all of those kind of baby steps along the way. But affirming policy are a really important place to start. Having all gender restrooms are another really important place. Not everyone fits within these girl-boy binaries, and a lot of students who do don't even feel safe in those restrooms. And so having access to bathrooms that are safer and more welcoming is important for LGBTQ people of all ages.
Thank you. Okay, our next question, actually there are two questions, but they are very similar. Do you do presentations at school, and does Rebecca do presentations at schools?
Yes, I absolutely do. Rebecca does some. She's gotten really overwhelmed with the amount of advocacy she's doing, so we're very careful in how much we commit her to. So her availability is not as much as mine, but feel free to reach out. JamieBreezehoff.com is where you can find me, and I'd be happy to talk with you.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, our next question is, did you ever encounter barriers to enrolling Rebecca in sports programs that aligned with her gender? If so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so we've been lucky in that we haven't encountered those programs. Rebecca wasn't into athletics at the time when she transitioned. She was a dancer. And so we did have a negative experience at the dance school she was attending and had to leave and go find a different one because of that. But she started athletics in 5th grade with middle school sports. And because our school had an affirming policy, and because the New Jersey SIAA policy is positive, she's been protected. We have seen with kind of the national conversation around this and the really upsetting news out of Idaho signing, the Idaho governor signing a bill that restricts transgender girls from participating in sports just this week, that we're hearing a lot more concern on a state and local level. Our laws still protect us, but we're having a lot more pushback. Rebecca's coaches and teammates are really wonderful, and so she's been okay so far, but we're aware of that kind of rising tide.
Thank you. I want to go into some anonymous questions just because not everyone can see them in the chat. So our first anonymous question is, can you speak to things that can be done specifically at elementary school levels to affirm LGBTQ students, both globally as a whole school and individually as a teacher alone?
Some shit. You know, we all start at different times, and that's all right.
Okay, absolutely. So I'm a big fan of books as a starting point. Just representation in books and literature is really powerful. And so having diverse books on your bookshelves and in your libraries is really important. We actually have, Rebecca's doing a book drive. If you go to mightyrebecca.com, we can send that link out later. You can apply to be a recipient to books that she's collecting, LGBTQ inclusive books. And we have a lot of elementary ones that we can send to your school and donate. So that's a little bit of an aside. But books are really wonderful. not separating kids into boys and girls groups is really important. It was one of the things that was most distressing to her in the time leading up to her transition. Even before she had language to say, I'm not a boy, she was very upset when being divided in those kinds of groups. And it's exclusive to kids that don't fit into that binary of boy or girl. Also looking at the way that the pictures you're using that are in your classrooms and in your books and your materials. Sometimes we do stuff where like, which one's a boy or a girl? And we're looking at long hair for girls and short hair for boys. And we're making a lot of assumptions about gender expression equating to identity. And so starting to break down those gender expectations and those boxes is really important. As far as individual students, making sure that they know you support them, being aware of conversations happening in the classroom, and really being on top of correcting misinformation. A lot of times kids will innocently say, oh, you can't do that, you're a boy, or you can't do that, you're a girl, and that's kind of where things start. And so start to break down those stereotypes and open possibilities for not only our trans or gender expansive students, but all of our students to fully be themselves.
Thank you. So not to be rude to those that have asked the questions, to everyone, they are as equally important, but when I save the chat later, we won't see the private questions. So I just want to make sure I get to those first, if that's okay. So the next one is, what can we do to help protect laws for transgender kids?
Well, you can talk to your legislators for sure, and make sure they are aware that you support this, that as an educator, as a constituent, these are important to you. Right now, on a federal level, there's a couple of different bills that are really important. The Equality Act is critical. There are there's some anti-bullying acts, the Tyler Clementi one for college, and there's an equivalent for younger, for K-12 schools. There's also a really important Every Child Deserves a Family Act, which protects LGBTQ young people in foster care and in adoption scenarios. And so talking to your federal legislators and saying that these are really important to you, and then talking to your state and local legislators to ask them what's going on, see if your school has a policy, then see if your town, what are the things on the docket there. And as far as on a state level, I highly recommend following Garden State Equality, who are really, as well as GLSEN in New Jersey, who are always offering opportunities for advocacy and engagement on the most pressing legislation. Ooh, sorry. Sarah.
Sorry. Okay. I was trying to know. I'm so sorry. This question's a little long, so I just want to read it as fast but as quickly as possible. What is your opinion on asking students to state their pronouns during introductions at the beginning of the year? This has become a common occurrence in my college experience, but I'm conflicted as to whether this is a good idea or not. Could it force students to feel that they have to reveal information they may not necessarily be ready to reveal, or make students feel like they have to state pronouns that they do not really identify with because they have not yet felt comfortable to come out in the safe environment that it is?
That is a great question, and it's challenging. I think the best way to frame it that I've heard, and I'm certainly not the expert, just from the conversations I've heard and been a part of, is an invitation to share pronouns, but to never require folks to share pronouns, because that's putting people in an uncomfortable and possibly unsafe situation. A lot of the students prior in the PRISM conversation were sharing that, or other educators were, about like written check-ins or submitting a piece of paper that says, this is my name and my pronouns, please call me this, at the beginning of the year, can be a really helpful way to do it privately so that that's shared. But students are constantly making decisions at that point, whether they are trans or out or not out yet, or who they're out to, about who they present to at any point with what language. And that can be really challenging. So the best thing I think educators can do is normalize it by sharing your own, invite folks to share them if they want, but not require it.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question, there was one anonymous question, but it goes with a public question. is there a law that mandates middle and high schools have a GSA? And do you have any tips for starting a GSA in a school that may not have one?
Okay, so there is no law mandating that a school has a GSA. There is a law protecting that if a student wants one, that you cannot you can't refuse one. There's some nuance there because you need an advisor, and the schools can put up roadblocks, but you can't just ban GSAs. As far as how to start them, really finding someone on faculty that says they're excited about this and want to be a part of it is the first part. And if you can pair them with students that are excited about it, then you're well on your way. I found we just started our middle school GSA here this year, and I expected pushback that we didn't actually have. There's also some nuance. Schools get around it or approach it a little differently sometimes by calling it an acceptance club or a diversity club. Now, there's some drawbacks to that, to not naming gender and sexuality or queer straight alliance or whatever that may be, but it also protects students who are not safe at home, whose parents, especially at a middle school level, may not sign those permission slips to attend that event. And so our school calls it an acceptance club because that makes it more accessible to the students who most need it. So those are some things to think about.
Thank you. Okay, Jamie, 2 more questions. I don't want to rush you. We're so thankful for you to be here today. We have just 2 last questions, if that's okay with you. And then, okay. So what simple statement can we as teachers say to students to let them know we fully support them?
Good question. I think it varies depending on the age and the context. But even saying at the beginning of the year that, everyone's welcome here and naming various identities or including examples of it when you talk. Again, there'll be a lot more examples or opportunities as you talk more about curriculum pieces, because those are all signals to students as well. But in general, to just say, these are the rules of our classroom. We accept all people, including this, not regardless of, because regardless is saying that we like you in spite of that. And that's an important nuance. And what was the second question? Or was that?
That was the first part. And
okay.
Then, have you done any advocacy work for intersectional trans communities?
Yeah, so I do a lot of listening to intersectional trans communities and understanding that for those that may not know, when we talk about intersectionality, we're saying that the trans community and the LGBTQ community are marginalized because of that identity or that part of who they are. But if you're already marginalized or experiencing discrimination and struggle because of other pieces of your identity, for instance, your race, your religion, your economic status or your immigration status, all of those things are going to compound. And so my work is to name that over and over again, to name the immense privilege that Rebecca has as someone with supportive parents who have master's level educations and that are stable, financially stable, and she's white and she fits into these gender norms and all of these things, and to lift up the voices of other people that are speaking to the unique struggles that exist outside of the space that our family inhabits.
Well, Allison is being the tech guru today. I just want to sort of briefly introduce myself, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Allison to introduce herself as well. Jamie, thank you so much. I love your presentation, and I'm so glad to have, crossed paths in a lot of these sort of locations, both legislatively and in the advocacy work. I think it's important to give a little background professionally before we sort of talk about this stuff. I've been teaching for 22 years in high school, and I'm an art history teacher by training. And, I think that sometimes I run into the idea that if you're in the creative areas, or of course you're gonna, maybe be drawn to this community somehow. I actually came to the work that I'm doing though, not through the discipline, but through an early GSA that we started at Rumson Fairhaven Regional High School, and struggles that a number of my students were having finding what were sort of socially normative experiences for them in the community. That led me to start Make It Better for Youth, and I worked with a number of people in our Monmouth County community. And by a number, I mean dozens and dozens of people who were ready to step up and say, we have people that want to talk on panels. We want to help you put together a queer prom. We want to make sure that there's support for teachers in schools that want to start GSAs, but just like talk to another teacher, maybe not a whole huge organization. And that work that we started like 11 and a half years ago brought us to this place where, you know, I get to meet Jamie when we are all testifying with the the Assembly Education Committee, or where I'm lobbying, or like as we are working on a pilot for LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, I get to meet and work with Allison. So there's a lot of foundation sort of professionally that brings us to this place. But I'm going to talk a little bit about New Jersey's kind of background with this. I'm going to talk a little bit about our program's shape and what we've done in conjunction with Garden State Equality. I'm going to talk about some of the folks who have contributed to this for a whole decade before this is even something that we're talking about professionally. No, I don't see them, Allison.
Okay. Do you see me?
I see you.
Okay, here, I felt weird staring at the screen. So do you want me to introduce myself first and then try
Yeah,
again?
you go ahead. Yep.
Okay. I don't have anywhere near as impressive of a background. You said in the beginning, I've been teaching history for 20 years. I got involved with the importance of diversity and educational equity through my master's degrees, first in administration, and then the work I've done towards the Holocaust and Genocide degree. And I served on a board of ed in Wall Township, which is what actually got me involved with Garden State Equality first, because, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, but I served on a board who wanted to reject a policy to support LGBTQ youth, that they thought that school psychologists and special ed teams needed to be involved, and that it was educators and administrators' jobs to out children, which is absolutely not the case, and in fact can be exceptionally dangerous. This past summer, I was able to get involved more deeply with Kate and with a whole bunch of amazing people, some of who are on here, because I signed up to start writing curriculum for the pilot and for the mandate, which got me involved in this. And then I also am working with one of the pilot schools, or was until we all got shut down, on integrating that curriculum into their daily lives. So that's kind of my exposure in a nutshell. And I also have a political angle to it too, because I work with the county LGBTQ caucus. I'm just an ally, doing the best that I can over here. So now, Kate, I'm going to try and share you.
Okay.
All right, bear with.
So, for a number of us who've been in education for a while, we are probably quite used to today's flavor is going to be, it's on the left side. We're there now, Allison. Great.
Is it there?
It's there. We're used to the sort of flavor of the month, whether it's a new educational thinker or a new solution for the classroom. And I kind of want to give a little bit of background and hopefully dispel some of the myths behind some of the popular language around this as a piece of legislation and what that might mean for us in our schools. And I will say upfront, and I'll say this many times, it will look differently for a lot of us in different schools because our schools adopt curriculum. Ultimately it's a board action. However, the path to adopting curriculum, lessons, supporting materials looks different district to district. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in New Jersey. This is no way unified as a process. Primarily, I think it's important for us to realize that this is, I'm talking to you guys today about this as a pedagogical place to start, what it is for teacher practice, but fundamentally, this is always about how we are interacting with the children in our room. We are coming at this from a place of outcomes, and we are looking to the ways that we as teachers in our own practice can perhaps alleviate or get in front of the especially negative and onerous outcomes for students who identify as LGBTQ, as well as their peers who, and Jamie made a great point earlier, when you have a GSA or you have positive visibility and affirmation in your school, it's not only the population of LGBTQ kids who experience greater positive outcomes, it's those that are not LGBTQ who learn so much about looking through a window at people that may not be necessarily like them. So several years ago, I think in 2013, was some of the original language was being floated in the New Jersey legislature. A number of groups have worked on this over time. We have now Jersey Shore Now, we have GLSEN, Garden State Equality, Make It Better for Youth, as well as individual participants in our government who have said that, we believe that there are ways that we can set forth either a larger kind of objective, something that's a statement of belief around what we think is important for students in New Jersey to have. And the piece of legislation that came out, S-1569, that was signed into law in 2019, required boards of education to include instruction, adopt instructional materials, and accurately portray political, economic, and social contributions to persons with disabilities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And it's kind of a huge mouthful, but it's also a very general mouthful. And with full disclosure, we're really addressing LGBTQ perspectives in what we're talking about today. There are some other groups and individuals in New Jersey who are beginning to work on persons with disabilities and their representation as well. What this means is, in New Jersey,
okay, good.
We have a long history of being at the forefront of our law against discrimination, which has been amended several times, including in 2006 for sexual orientation and gender identity. We have in 1994, and Allison and most of you in this room are probably familiar with the adoption of
they did go out to
curriculum.
Hey, I'm sorry,
In
just
2002, we have the Amistad.
Yeah, somebody needs to silence their mic.
This Monday. They couldn't go out before that.
1 second. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And in 2002, we adopted the Amistad curriculum in New Jersey. And in the most recent piece, and Jamie touched on this as well, is we have the New Jersey Transgender Guidance in Schools, which was adopted in 2018. And these are all major efforts that are statewide efforts among individuals, groups, and our legislators to make sure that schools move forward in not just presentation, but representation of all the people who are a part of our population, our diverse state, our history, and our particular future. And in looking at this particular legislation for New Jersey, was one other state, California, which passed what they call the FAIR Act, which was the Fair, Accurate, and Inclusive, Respectful Act, and they passed that in 2011, mandating LGBTQ inclusion in social studies from grades K through 12. To date, they're not fully implemented, and some of the lessons that we hope to get in front of came from critiques of what's going on in California and other academic critiques nationally. We are the second state in the nation to sign something similar into law, and New Jersey's is quite different insofar as it covers middle school through high school, so grades 6 to 12, 5 to 12, depending on some of the presentations, but across all content areas. And so that means inclusive of not just your humanities, where we traditionally see some of these implementations, but phys ed and health, world languages, arts, performing arts, and maybe even tech classes and things of that nature.
Hey, can I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah, please.
The other thing is, Kate mentioned the Amistad and the Holocaust mandates that the state already has, and that's something that I think I can safely say all of us who worked on the curriculum had in mind, because anybody who's familiar with those mandates, particularly if you're a social studies teacher, knows that there were resources provided and it was just sort of an unsupported mandate. And so we're trying to make sure that this is not the case, that there are mechanisms that teachers feel supported while they implement the curriculum in their classrooms, that they have a launching pad with our lesson plans to move from, but also the security and the resources to devise and implement their own plans or to modify plans that they're already working with, and not to make it feel like another thing on a checklist for a CUSAC or for lesson plans that has to be done, but something that's wholly organic and enjoyable even in the classroom.
We're very aware of the fact that districts do not have the same sets of resources everywhere. Teachers do not have the same sets of resources everywhere. And we are hoping that by presenting people-powered, teacher-powered perspectives or approaches, that we can get in front of the fact that an unfunded mandate so often means that there are terrible difficulties in implementation. So, you know, part of our action was to say, what can we address knowing what we know, based on what has already happened in New Jersey. And so I'd mentioned Amistad and I mentioned the Holocaust Commission. You know, without funding behind those, we do not see 100% saturation. So we know that, but with additional legislation, additional language from the DOE, there has to be a way that we can help bring the rest of our marginalized communities forward with us. And we know academically, and Jamie spoke to it earlier, the idea of intersectionality and all of these categorizations, these marginalizations that happen to individuals based on their race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, et cetera, gender and sexual orientation, create places that are experience the least amount of social justice, the most discrimination, the greatest disadvantage. And so we thought it was incumbent upon us as we approach this, that first of all, we cannot say that there is one history or one perspective of LGBTQ AI folks that are represented in any specific lesson or broader curriculum, but it is a multitude, and it must bring forward with it the views, the lives, the experiences of those at all of these intersections as well. So, you know, no matter what we say and share from a lesson standpoint, we also have to say that that is going to look different for me in my high school than it may look for another educator in another district. We must know who we are, we must know who we serve, and how our school, what systems are in place in our school that recognize multiplicity, that shape how the teachers are approaching their students, and also professionally how those teachers have gotten to that place pedagogically to begin with, and where we're starting with. So, you know, we have to have this kind of solid foundation for acknowledging, you know, what it is, the work that we wanted to do. And we also then need to know that there is a lot of really terrible numbers. Jamie went through the Trevor Project data. This is data from 2017 GLSEN School Climate Survey, which looks specifically at middle school and high school students. This is a study that's been going on for over 20 years now. I'm not going to read this to you, you all can see it, but what a daily experience for an LGBTQAI identified student in a school is, you know, make certain that they are not, you know, vastly speaking anyway, there's a great number of them that have a negative experience associated with school. I do like to think about this from the place of us as you know, physical sentient beings. You know, when you have these experiences, you can't help but have a negative framework for how you're approaching your school day. You potentially are fearful, and these kinds of things get in the way of you having a positive learning experience. Any one of these things that's an impediment to a student walking into the school building or having a full positive school day means that we're failing our students. And so, you know, my approach has always been to take this very personally. It is my schools, it's my colleagues, it's my broader community's commitment to making sure these students get in school and have access to their rightful education. And we also know, and you see some data on the right-hand side of the slide, that this also impacts teachers who identify as LGBTQ. And, you know, and that's a silent, it's an invisible population. You know, there's some of us that are out, and there are a number of us that aren't, because our environments are, you know, if the students aren't experiencing welcoming environments, one can't expect the adults in the building are either. And so, you know, we have to attend to those pieces as well. So our position moving forward has been that we want to promote, we want to have an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum in New Jersey, because our outcomes for all of our students will then be positive, you know, or more positive. When we are dealing with safety, when we're dealing with absenteeism, when we're dealing with SEL, I mean, a number of you are well aware that there is a great push in the education for social emotional learning and support for students. We know how that ties in or dovetails with traditional academic learning. And we know that by raising the stakes in terms of increasing equity for all, we bring everybody with us in our kind of path. There is additional data for what students experience. And we know that over a roughly 20-year period, that there is a correlation between the increase in GSAs, increase in visibility in teaching staff, increase in visibility in popular culture even, with the positive student experience in their schools. We see that verbal harassment, physical assaults and harassment drop in accordance with more positive presentation around them in school and beyond. Actually, Allison, we can skip this one too. I'll come back to that a little bit later. We know that students that are taught positive representations are so few, and that there is an almost equal percentage of students that know they've been taught absolutely negative or incorrect information about LGBTQ topics. And when we start talking about how students get access to accurate information, I mean, if we were in a room, I would say raise your hand if you're somebody that's had to explain to students how to find authentic data, how to research accurate information, what's a reliable source. And when you start thinking about things with a higher, I think higher stakes involved, how critical it becomes for students to be able to find accurate and positive LGBTQ inclusive content in their own libraries, in their own classrooms. You know, we have certainly some challenges. I love that, you know, Jamie's approach to a lot of this has been, we're going to help schools then increase or improve their library. And I think there's a lot of smaller organizations locally that want to do things similar to that. And there can be some barriers, I'm sure, that people are experiencing to getting some additional materials in school, but it's a great place to start. 2 books in a classroom, and I guarantee you the students for whom it matters see that very quickly. I just put in this slide deck, and I will share as part of the resources that Sarah is sharing out with everyone. There are the full climate survey results for 2017, and there's also a make your own climate survey tool. And that is something that, you know, with permission, I believe in most of your schools, that you could use to assess where your own, you know, student body perceives the school to be at, or teachers themselves. And that can help you for preparing for sort of what our next steps are, which are, you know, how do we move towards pedagogical, you know, inclusion? And so the strategies that exist for educators to plan and prepare, you know, what's in place? You know, is it just that we're doing individual research and we are submitting lesson plans piece by piece? What is our actual goal aiming for LGBTQ inclusion in school? What about the other parts of the legislation? Is there somebody in your district who's working on inclusion of people with disabilities? Do you already have people in your school working with Amistad or the Holocaust and Genocide Commission? And it's, I've found in some of our work, the larger conversation around who do we have the most in common with first, helps us take some of that, the distance out of that legwork of moving LGBTQ inclusion into place. We're very fortunate as a group of educators working together to come from a place where we are very question oriented, where we're using critical thinking techniques. And so we're not just talking about all rote learning. And it's not to say that there is no place for some of that, but a lot of this finds its home when we start getting to places where there's a larger conversation in the classroom. There are kind of four, we talk a little bit about the idea of transformational pedagogies, and it's part of a larger system. I've listed four of them here. We start talking about contributions. That's sort of our heroes and holidays. When we talk about a certain day in January every year that a number of schools have Monday off, we all say, oh, right, that's MLK Day. What is the lesson that happens around that? And a number of places, there's still a kind of one-time, we'll say, overview of who this person is, and perhaps the civil rights movement in the United States. And we have other approaches that then begin to deepen that learning. How do we talk about that then, perhaps Martin Luther King, in addition to other kinds of civil rights figures? How do we teach our students about social action through this? And then finally, the transformative piece is walking students through a whole set of questions and understanding so they can see all of these viewpoints and not just something as a fact or not a fact. As you guys may see me looking down occasionally, telling Allison to switch the slide.
You could also just say that.
Right. And so a couple of years ago, a group of educators in New Jersey got together, and we started working with what were already established modes for lesson plan writing. Some of it coming out of Hattie, some of it coming out of Wiggins-Mackay, about making learning visible or understanding by design, and saying that if we are intentional in our lesson planning, if we strive for clarity and we demonstrate to students what we want them to learn, if we script our educational plan for students, even if we don't always have all of the native knowledge, native content knowledge, and we have to learn some on our own, we're going to make our most, our best impression by moving these things forward in an honest place. And so at this point, I'm going to put Allison on alert here.
Okay.
And let her talk a little bit, because I'm somebody who did a lot of shaping of getting groups of people together to do this. And Allison is one of those people who came into our community and did a lot of this work. So I'm going to turn it over to her right now to talk to you a little bit about what that looked like and how that has been put in practice in her classroom and her practice.
So I have no fancy slide deck or anything like that to share with you. I'm just going to kind of speak from the heart and give you a couple of different things that have fed into what this has meant to me. There's been a lot of questions and conversations first with the student group and then within these presentations about allowing students to know that they're in a safe space and that you are a teacher that they can look to or support. As educators, we know that we have our lesson plans and we have the curriculum that we're assigned to teach, but at the end of the day, there's also this thing that's fancifully required or referred to as the hidden curriculum. The things that happen in our classroom or are accepted as norms that aren't written anywhere, but are just constantly reinforced. That's the first place that we can all start before we even get to lesson planning and the mandate or anything else, is just being very conscientious and very, I like the word intentful with what we're doing. I was lucky enough to have a student teacher this year, and it's been a while since I've taken one, and I don't know if she's still here, but I think my student teacher from a decade ago was in this before, which made me feel really old. But one of the things that he and I have spoken about is just the importance of correcting student language. And this came up in one of the conversations, I think maybe with Jamie, but if you have students who are throwing around words like gay or like retard in your classroom and you pretend that you don't hear them, that's a problem. And so we need to create environments as educators where we kind of stop and talk to our students, and you know your student, you know your class well enough. If you do that as a whole group or if you do that with the student one-on-one, but your whole class needs to see that you don't tolerate that language. And that's one of the very first places that they're going to know that you are that teacher, that you are a safe place, and that, you know, you are affirming who they are. One of the other things that guides my own teaching is imagining what it's like to sit in a classroom where I never ever learn about somebody who looks like me, who sounds like me, who lives like me. And there are students who are still sitting in our classrooms who have that experience daily. So if we don't talk about the LGBTQ community, if we don't talk about, you know, our undocumented immigrants, if we don't talk about people who are poor, then we're completely disavowing certain students' lifestyles, and that's not okay either. So that idea of representation matters. And so just having honest conversations with your students matters. So before you even get to lesson planning, there's a lot of things that you can do within your own classroom to make sure that your students feel as though you see them. The pronoun question came up a lot, and I think it might be different at the high school level or the middle school level than it is at the college level. I'm a huge fan of a Google survey at the beginning of a semester or of a school year, depending on what kind of schedule you're on. And in that survey, I absolutely ask what preferred pronouns are, but I also ask if they're using those pronouns widely, or if that's something that they're only using for themselves, and if they have a difference between how they identify to themselves or how they identify to the class, because that's important too. You know, my survey includes questions to find out what kind of issues my students are dealing with outside the classroom. So I know, you know, if homework's not getting done, it's because somebody's working an overnight shift to help pay the rent, as opposed to just laziness. And students will be honest with you about those things. So I do it through a survey, and they check off what they want me to do. If they say I identify as he to myself, but she in class, then that's what I roll with. But at least I know that that's something that that student is working with. So I think that if you can gather all that information and really reflect on what you accept and what you allow in your own classrooms before you even start with the curriculum, it's, you know, that's a good starting ground. In my own classes, I teach history, and I think that mandates like this are easier to implement in history classes, because I feel like we're the ones who've been battling with them or getting them, at least since the 20 years that I've been teaching. As far as, you know, this is concerned, the first thing I do in almost all of my lessons is I include the question of whose voice is missing. It's one of the easiest ways to kind of allow, first of all, that conversation about intersectionality, but second of all, to have students sort of reflect on why is history taught from a specific point of view? Because if we're honest, we know that a lot of history is taught from that white upper class man point of view. And we have been working and working and working to change that perspective. But, you know, we'll teach a lesson on the Industrial Revolution. And when I'm finished talking about it, I'll be like, okay, whose voice is missing from this lesson? Why is that voice missing? And so we'll start talking about, you know, gender roles during that time and different things. And then students can work in small groups and they can figure out, well, why is that voice missing? Is it purposeful? Is it because it wasn't represented at that time? Is it because it was purposefully silenced? And that's a really great way to not necessarily have a formal lesson, but when you have that time to have that conversation, to work with students in that way. The other, you know, I teach a Holocaust and genocide class, and, you know, Kate was talking about find the people who are already doing the work. And I don't think that you can teach Hologen. And by the way, a big shout out to the beginning of this. I got my start with all of this. I teach ID 1800 in a high school classroom because of Kean. I started my master's work because of those 2 free courses. So I highly recommend all of that. And that will be my plug right there for the Holocaust Resource Center. You can't teach a genocide course and not understand what it means to be a marginalized community. So, language matters, and that's, I've gotten that lesson from that as well. And so, when I teach my Holocaust course, one of the things we learn about is the pink triangle, because that's part of the Holocaust. Kids know about Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel, but they don't necessarily know about any of the things in between and the other groups who were victimized by the Holocaust. So we do a whole lesson on that. When I teach civil rights, a lot of times the civil rights movement is primarily taught from Black voices, and then sometimes Hispanic voices, sometimes Indigenous American voices, but a lot of times the whole voice of the LGBTQ community is left out, even though they were a huge part of that whole time period as well. So that's something I include in there as well.
Can I jump in real quick, Allison?
No.
Listening to you talk about the voices that are missing, it reminds me of one of the conflicts that happens for a number of teachers, I think, and I saw some of it reflected in the chat earlier on during Jamie's portion, is that, what if this is seen as some sort of challenging or complex material? How do we respond to negative input? What if a kid comes in and says they told their parents what they learned and their parents said it was wrong? Like, how do we manage of some of those challenges in the classroom? I mean, I'm in a high school classroom, Allison's in a high school classroom. It's a little bit different for us, I think, than perhaps middle school and even elementary. And do you want to talk about that for a moment, perhaps?
I mean, I can try, because I only teach high school. I mean, I do have students who will speak to me honestly about religious beliefs that don't, I'm going to say don't allow, and that's not necessarily the right word choice here, but I mean, I have students who see being part of the LGBT community as juxtaposed to their religion in a negative way. And what I basically have to tell them is that within my classroom, and I'm a Roman Catholic, and I guess technically it's not, but the Pope has kind of lessened that. But I tell them that there's no human that's wrong, there's no human that's illegal, there's nothing like that, and that I'm sorry if their religious beliefs are different than that, but that in my classroom, this is how it is. And I have that, I have signs all over my classroom that support that. I have to knock wood, because I'm probably gonna jinx myself right now. I have never had a parent call to complain about what's being taught in my classroom, and I will be the first person, when they talk about illegal immigrants, to say no person is illegal, they're undocumented. Like, I stop those conversations and really fast. So I always tell my students that they are entitled to believe what they want to believe. The rule of thumb in my classroom is that we will discuss things. They're allowed to have opinions that are different than mine. All of those opinions have to be defended with fact. It's not just because I said so or because this is how I feel. Like, they really have to drill down and tell me why they feel the way that they feel. And I do have a classroom that supports that. We've had some really uncomfortable conversations in my classroom, and Jamie said it before, whatever your political beliefs are, I really don't care. You do you, and I'll do me, or whatever. But particularly during the 2016 election, I had an openly gay student turn around to a kid in a Trump shirt and ask him, how do you support him and be my friend? And the conversation went beautifully. And I am blessed to have created an environment in my classroom that allows for things like that. But I think it's a matter, again, of language and law. You tell your students, like, this is what I'll accept and this is what I won't accept. And you let them know that differing opinions are allowed, but at the same time, you explain to them in a respectful way why you don't adhere to their opinions, or why you believe differently. So, I mean, I've also had students, because high schoolers are high schoolers, that when they find out that I do this work, look at me and be like, but you have a husband and kids. Yes, I do. It's sometimes hard for them to put those things together. But I think that, as much as you're able to, and depending on how supported, like, I am very supported in my district for the work that I'm doing. But as long as you can, like, you have those honest conversations, you stay supported, and your district will support you in what you're doing, and they'll help you. I mean, it's important as we do this work, and particularly as the mandate comes into fruition, that us as teachers know where our district stands and where they're going to do. I mean, there's a law and there's policy, but I would absolutely urge teachers to be familiar with what the law says and how the policy reads. Nobody can opt out of this, and be prepared to know what you don't know. So as you do your lessons, if you have questions and if you are not familiar with language, find resources, find people that you can talk to, find people you can ask. But I think that, when you do this, it shouldn't be like, and here's today's gay lesson. It should just be something that's wholly integrated into our plans. And again, it's much easier for me as a history teacher to say that because I know that a whole tapestry of people have made history. It's not like the LGBTQ community just sort of popped up one day. Like, they've been making our history since the beginning. So it's important that, we look at it that way, like it's wholly organic. In other classes, it's not so easy. And we struggled with this when we put together the curriculum, and Kate knows this as well. There's certain classes it was just a little bit harder. English and social studies, there was a lot. But in math, one of the easiest things we talked about doing is just, as you're devising math problems, change your language. Tom and Harry can go get the milk. It doesn't have to be Tom and Sue. There's really easy ways to do it. That doesn't necessarily have to be devising a whole lesson, but simply just changing language or using more inclusive language when you do your studies. With government and politics, anybody who teaches civics classes, there's so many court cases and different things that are easy to integrate and are really a part of our history that should be integrated into your curriculum already, and probably are. That you might be doing this already, but with the less, and don't even ask me to talk about a science class because there's no way I can help you there. But there's lots of other ways that we can do this other than just specific lesson planning. And I think that the other thing, as far as the mandate is concerned, that we really wanted to drive home is, again, that we don't want this to be another thing that you have to check off when you're doing your lesson plans. We want you kind of to be reflective in this and to work as a team within your departments and in your schools, because hopefully, ideally, and maybe I'm being a little too hopeful in this, but you're probably doing a lot of this already and you don't realize you're doing it. We just have to be a little more thoughtful and a little more what's the word I want, consistent in how we're doing this. But I can't even begin to tell you, and some of you probably really know this already, when you really do start talking about all of your students, when you're talking about everybody who sits in your classroom and you make an effort to incorporate all of them. I teach Jehovah's Witnesses, and so I always make sure that when I do the Holocaust, I teach about what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses. They're floored because they've never had anybody bother to teach about their religion or talk about their religion before. So it's the idea of just seeing yourself reflected in a lesson, particularly when it's in a positive way. It can sometimes mean the difference between life and death, and that's not dramatic for some students.
I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what this is and what it isn't also. The way that the legislation is worded gives no direction for what anybody at elementary school can do or should be or can be held to. There is no language currently right now that holds any accountability anywhere. I'm following the chat, and I know there's a question about CUSAC. Yes, we would hope that a particularly enterprising district would say in their content areas that they could attend to LGBTQ inclusive lesson writing and or curriculum as a way to sort of substantiate that they're addressing that for CUSAC. But when I talk with administrators, I go one step further and I say that there is data that we have on truancy, on students coming to school, on chronic absenteeism that absolutely correlate with gender and sexual orientation data. And you have a very difficult time when you say, we look at the high percentage of students that won't even come to school or have negative feelings about school, and that overlies with SOGI information. And then you look at those that are chronically absent. We know that we have to make meaning out of some of that, and hopefully a district can attend to that as a means of addressing that one particular characteristic in their CUSAC reports. Allison was talking a little bit about biology and the sciences and areas that don't necessarily have a specific person or a specific event behind it. And I think some of our approach, so, as a teacher group, we got together and partnered with Garden State Equality to produce a set, about 6 so far, lessons, and I'm not going to use the word curriculum here because it's not part of a larger framework, but about 6 lessons across a number of content areas from 5th through 12th grades that model, and I talk about them as a lighthouse lesson, right? Something that gives us a bright guide that helps lead us towards what's both a best practice as a teacher, how to set forth goals with content that maybe we haven't been mindful about or haven't been able to address because of its being perceived as challenging or controversial, and how to lead students of different ages and different capabilities and different content areas through this content. And when you're writing a lesson from that place, and Allison can speak to this as well, you go from generating your one lesson that you might put a handful of hours into for a lesson that you'll use years upon years into your career, to turning around days to create a lesson in concert with other people. Allison was part of a social studies team, and they had a great deal of conversation worrying about just how one 8th grade lesson might look, how one 10th grade lesson might look, how it can be scaffolded up or down based on specific age group, content, maybe some parallel conversations that could be had, trying to be intentional the entire way. And we know that with everything that's going on for us as a professional in education, it's not possible to do that with every lesson. What we want people to do is say, there is one new piece of information I want to make sure that I imbue. There's one new conversation I need to have with my students to be more intentional. We're going to talk about women's history. I mean, women's history, isn't it all of our history? And there's some of them are women. There are approaches that we take in our own sort of semantic approach that model to our students what we're talking about, that hidden curriculum, when we're standing up, when we're in the front of the classroom, when we're organizing the classroom around a particular lesson. So, we don't have support from the state with all of these other pieces of accountability. All the onus is going to be on your independent district. And that's why we're in the place of really kind of, this kind of gospel around teacher-centered approaches to inclusivity.
And I have to say it again, like, we really try to create lessons that would be very manageable within the classroom, that you could use in whole or in part, and also lessons that would inspire other lessons, but also make you sort of look at what you've already been doing and be like, oh wait, I've got this, like I can do this over here. And teamwork matters. And again, I can't speak to where you work or who you work with, but I know that already in my own department, we've started talking about what this will look like in everybody else's curriculum. And I've worked with a bunch of the teachers in my department just to give them ideas. And we're not a pilot school, but I'm their guinea pig. And I've been happy to sort of help them see what this is going to look like. And I think that once you kind of get that conversation, you sort of understand that some of you are already doing this, incorporating it into your lesson plans isn't going to be hard, and that sometimes you can do it not necessarily through a specific lesson, but through this conversation about voices that might be missing, or even just introducing another aspect or another dimension of something that you've already been doing. And again, I think for us as social studies teachers, for me as social studies, but I'm sure there's others of you out there, we're constantly working, and Kate said it, history is all of us. And so we've constantly been working to make sure that our history is exceptionally intersectional and inclusive, because that's what we do as social studies teachers. It might be more challenging to other subject matters, but again, we do have these lighthouse lessons and just also general ideas of what little changes you can make in your classroom. Again, so your students feel included, represented, and important.
So, yep, okay. I have a whole number of notes here, so I'm
I'm looking at the same thing.
Okay. I don't know, Sarah, I don't know if you're there right now. Perhaps we can start taking some questions.
Yes, I have a document of questions, so I'll start those, and people are more than welcome to continue asking questions in the meantime. Kate and Allison, I know you talked about how students cannot opt out of this curriculum and learning about this in the classroom, but I did have an anonymous question that says, what can you do if some students don't want to participate in class when talking about LGBTQ+ history?
Well, if you're speaking specifically about history, and it's a piece, it's a lesson plan that's been approved by your supervisor, and it's part of your curriculum that's approved by your Board of Education, then the school has spoken and said that this is a necessary piece of learning for the students in that classroom. Remember, like, LGBTQ inclusive curriculum in terms of the legislation is one thing. It doesn't mean only history. So we're talking about normalizing content. You wouldn't allow them to opt out of talking about Greek civilization. You wouldn't allow opting them out of talking about the New Deal. There's no reason to opt out of a lesson that perhaps talks about marginalization and civil rights work of LGBTQ people in the 50s and 60s, because there was a movement before we got to Stonewall. So my response is very hard line. I'm not treating this any different than any other material that we have that is a sort of approved part of our curriculum, period.
And I would absolutely second that. I mean, it's just another thing that we're teaching, and students don't get to opt out of mandated curriculum. With that said, I would almost deal with it as though it's a reluctant learner too, so this is what we're doing in class today. But if I consistently note that the same student isn't participating when we get to that part of a lesson or in those conversations, being who I am, at some point I would probably pull that student aside, or maybe request a lunch meeting and sit down and be like, what's up? And see if I can, find out why that student's not participating, and have that conversation, with him or her to find it out. But I 100% support the hard line that Kate's taken.
Great, thank you both. There's two questions specifically for Allison. Allison, are you able to share that survey that you do in the beginning of your class that you mentioned earlier?
Sure can. I'm going to absolutely have to dig it up, but I can definitely share the Google form out. That's not a problem. I'll send that to you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you, Allison. We'll put that in the resource doc if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And then the other question for you is, can you speak more about when you worked with administration who were not understanding of LGBTQ students? Specifically, how did you advocate for students who were being affected?
I actually have not been in a situation where I've had administration who was not supportive. So I've worn a whole bunch of hats. I teach in Ocean Township, and my administration has been as supportive as possible of me in this work, and already talking about using me as a resource for professional development next year when the mandate comes to fruition and things like that. For 5 years, I served on the Wall Township Board of Education in the town where I live. And that is where I met with a reluctant board. I had, when we were about to reaffirm the policy for LGBTQ students, particularly trans students, and I don't know, I'm going to give you like a really quick lesson. When policy comes to a board, it's usually generated by a policy-making company. Boards of education are allowed to suggest changes to it, but particularly if the policy is supported by law or by legislation, it's a no-brainer, you're going to pass it. At that time, I sat on a board, and it's all public. I mean, the meetings are taped, but I sat on a board of education that was exceptionally reticent about passing that policy. They wanted to know if they could not pass it, like what would happen to us if we didn't pass it. I had one board member who actually believed that being trans was just a mental illness. And there was others who thought that the policy should include measures that meant calling school psychologists or bringing in the special education team to work with the student. And also they were exceptionally offended by the fact that the policy was very specific about the fact that teachers were not to tell parents if a child identified a certain way at school. So for me, like that was, you have to, and I'm going to speak for me, like that gets me all angry and upset, and that's not how you govern. So my points to my colleagues on the board at that point in time were that for some students, the only place that they feel safe identifying as who they are is at school, because at home it could get them in trouble, it could get them hurt, it could be dangerous, and that outing a child could actually be putting them in harm's way. And then to completely just reiterate over and over again that being part of the LGBTQ community is not something that requires special education or child psychology, in help, that's whatever. So I had to deal with that. And quite frankly, my best resource at that point, Ashley was still the the Safe Schools Coordinator at Garden State Equality. So I reached out to her for guidance on working with the board, and she helped me put together a letter. I worked with the board attorney, who also knew that this was law and that it had to go through. And I just worked on helping to educate my fellow board members. But at the end of the day, a law is a law, and it was our job as board members to support the law and to support the students the way that the law said. So some of us did it because we knew it was right, and others did it because they had to.
Great, thank you, Allison. There are more questions for you, Allison, but I don't want to put you directly on the spot. One question is, I'm on the team to revise the social studies curricula in our district to uphold the mandate. Is there a way for your team to work with us or review our lessons to ensure they are appropriate, meaningful, or provide feedback?
Kate?
Yep.
Okay. That sounds like a fun job to me, but I don't know what are.
Yeah, there are, I mean, you know, there are a number of methods for that process. You know, Make It Better for Youth has its own sort of PD arm where I have coaches that work with teaching teams, administrative coaches that come in and do that piece from the academic standpoint. We work in concert with Garden State Equality for the advocacy and the pieces that are sort of your culture and climate. And Allison and I, our whole team of writers, are all people that I think are generally interested in helping. You know, you can certainly, our contact information will be shared as part of this presentation, and you can just reach out to us directly for what kinds of input are best for your team.
Great, thank you. Allison, this one's specifically directed to you, but I think Kate, maybe you'd be able to answer as well. How do we carefully and cautiously navigate these conversations within the homeschool model?
I want to say a little piece first, and then I'm going to turn over Allison for some of her responses. As somebody who's navigating this, teaching right now, I have 100 students of my own. I'm trying to teach a studio art class, by the way, with kids I'm trying to make sure there are materials that can be found in one's home. So this is all pretty wild times. One of the most important things for any kind of distance learning is that we have to be so careful about what we're saying, and we have to say so much more than we think we need to. And that is to say, it's almost writing verbatim. It's almost like providing your students with a transcript. And so I think that you know, there are some approaches. If we're doing this in this kind of model now, we are making certain that we are addressing all of the people around us, that we continue to be inclusive by using language that models that inclusivity and intentionality wherein it's appropriate and necessary. And that can be everything from when you're doing an attendance check-in post on Google Classroom, you're saying, hey friends, instead of hey guys, right? We're modeling all of the incremental ways that we can be inclusive, all the way up through the more complex ones, which are with perhaps AP level high school kids, launching questions that are intended to have them think through the many facets of a particular identity. And I think a little bit about having taught AP Art History. I think about the kinds of questions we use for our kind of FRQs that have to do with identity and the ways that students will address femininity, feminism. They might address racial and ethnic identity or gender and sexuality. And so I can be intentional inside of those particular subjects, but I have to use even more language because of the kind of teaching model that we have to use now.
I don't know if this question is about like a committed homeschooling environment or what we're using right now. So twofold.
I think it's right now.
Okay, because I was gonna say my sister actually homeschooled my nephew and my nieces like long term, and she and I talked about this, and I know that she integrated conversations like this through her use of art and literature and history lessons, and so hers was exceptionally intentional, but you know, a very well-rounded introduction. You know, as of right now, I mean, I guess I can only take my experience with my own children, and they're in 7th and 4th grade. And so, you know, we have had conversations, and they're probably going to need some sort of therapy when they get older because of the things that I do to them. God love them. But, you know, we had a whole conversation today, and my son was saying something to me. And I said to him, well, why are you assuming that's a man? and so, we have that whole, conversation. So I think it again, it has to do with choices of language, of making sure that they're exposed to a wide variety of ideas and resources, but of being very careful about your language, very intentional with your language. My own students, I don't do the boys and girls thing. I'm very careful about that, but they will tell you all the time I call them pumpkins, because it's just a good word to use. But with my own kids, as I homeschool them right now, I have conversations with them about what they're reading. I will correct their friends if they're in my house and they use words I don't like, or even if I can hear them on that headset for Xbox, things like that. I guess it's just making sure that the rules that you apply with the kids that you have been given are the same rules you apply with the ones that are your own, right? The rules that I have in my classroom about respect, about language, about acceptance, about love are the same things that I apply in my own house, and in my own homeschooling lessons. And I look at what they're going over in class, and I talk about what their teacher talked about with them. And any of you out here who are Holocaust people, or who have taken courses through Kean, or who have done any of that kind of work, the very first book my son came home with this year was The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and I had to be very careful because I have a lot of opinions about that book. And that's a really good example of, like, what is your teacher talking to you about? What have you learned? What did you think about this? And just again, being the same pedagogically sound person you would be with the students you're given, be with your own kids when you're homeschooling. And again, if you don't know, Dr. Google's a wonderful thing.
I see a question in the chat. Actually, I'm going to answer right now. We have some questions about the lessons that we've written, Lighthouse lessons, and their availability. Because those lessons are part of a pilot right now, there's actually been a study, and unfortunately it's a truncated study because of the nature of what has happened to school. There are our partnership, Make It Better for Youth, with Garden State Equality. We will be making the lessons available. There will be a sign-up basis, I believe late May, early June this year. And then after that point, probably around the middle of the summer, there'll be, you'll still have to sign up for the website, similar to like you would for Amistad curriculum. But you will have access to a website with any of the lessons that have been created as part of this, free and open to use. There'll be information on our writers, so there's people that you can contact, and all of that good stuff. There's also going to be a symposium, which is now rescheduled because it was supposed to be in May. We're having LGBTQ inclusive curriculum symposium in October at Monmouth University, the 19th and the 20th, I believe. Please don't quote me on that date, but it's in or around that time period at this point. And it'll be a full day. It's sort of an evening reception, and then a full day learning opportunity for schools, PLCs, individual educators, pre-service teachers, are all the tracks coming in to attend workshops by people like our writers and coaches like Allison, as well as we have early and elementary education resources and people presenting, and more and more and more. So many good things I can't even begin to list.
Great, thank you both. One question that I received anonymously is looking for your advice. The two of you, what would you say to a colleague who expresses discomfort or does not agree with including LGBTQ representation?
You want to do it, or you want me to do it?
Go ahead, you start.
I've been in that situation already, because this conversation came up at a PD that we had, like a district-wide PD that we had, and there were some people, again, I'm the guinea pig, who had questions about that and who did express discomfort. But I think the same hard line that we take with our students is the one that we have to take with our colleagues. This is a mandate, and not only is it a mandate, but like it requires a little bit of reflection, and people are people, and the LGBTQ community exists. People are people. We love them. They're good. Like I have a hard time. Like I have to bite my tongue a little bit before I engage in these conversations. But at the end of the day, you can tell colleague, basically this is a mandate and you have to do it whether you're comfortable with it or not. But then you also just want to, depending on the relationship you have with that colleague, or somebody else might have with that colleague, because there's lots of ways to navigate this, right? If you can't have the conversation, maybe somebody else can better have the conversation. you know, whether you agree with it or not, whether you're comfortable with it or not, the chances that you have somebody in your classroom who identifies as part of that community are exceptionally high. And what a disservice you're doing to them as an educator if you decide that this isn't important and that they realize that you don't think this is important or that it's not valid. Like, take your personal feelings out of it and realize what you're doing to a student if you're saying this mandate is not important to me because I don't believe it's important, or I don't believe it's necessary, or those people make me uncomfortable. It's, you know, there's lots of ways to have it, but I would absolutely take the same hard line with a colleague that I would with a student with regards to this.
I have I think, and I work with a lot of truly amazing colleagues who are doing this work in a lot of different ways. There's some folks that are here today who I teach with or who are in my neighboring districts. Shout out to the RFH and Rumson Schools people who are doing this in not just Holocaust and genocide education perhaps, but they're making sure to use the language to include vocabulary, to approach the subject even when it's not the core or the direct objective of the lesson. And in so doing, they model to their colleagues that they are able to do it even if it isn't the center of the particular lesson. And I give a lot of people, I'd like to give a lot of room for people who are uncomfortable because they're naming it themselves for the first time, but that tells us about the power and the importance of using language and naming in general, because it then models that it's okay to say it. I regularly see, you know, adults who go pie-eyed when they hear kids use the word queer in a positive way, in a socially acceptable way in school, and being caught with not knowing how to differentiate between that as an epithet or that as a word of community. And that tells me a little bit about the things that I want to have some compassion for the people I work with who are engaging with language in a way that is so different than perhaps I have as somebody who's been out, you know, the majority of my career. And so when I'm talking to somebody and they're uncomfortable with content, my professional responsibility is to drill into why is it uncomfortable and help them then gain a measure of confidence around handling that situation. More often than not, 99 out of 100 times is because they don't know how to respond to a challenge from a student. It's not because their moral compass is off or any challenge like that. And that tells me how important it is to script a lesson, to consider all of the ways that you might have student response, to worry in a professional manner about how we respond to a kid who says something that gets a laugh or gets more negative feedback, instead of keeping our lesson kind of on track. These are the things that derail us. They're the butt jokes and the fart jokes of the middle school classroom. And I don't mean to be, you know, off color, but, you know, if we start saying to our kids that like all questions are encouraged, and we start to draw that line, you know, Jamie, I love her spectrum of things. When we start talking about different kinds of curiosity, and we have to filter student responses through that kind of thing. Is this lurid or is this appropriate? And how we move them. Fundamentally, we're teachers and we have to move them to that place. So in terms of the original question, this is where supervisors, this is where administrative leadership has a great amount of impact on helping their teams, making sure they have the time to work together as teaching teams, making certain that there's professional development that's appropriate and readily available, that there's supports in place all year long, not just 3 professional days, so that people, individuals, adults that are in a classroom that are navigating these topics with our young people themselves are confident to approach it.
I'm also just going to piggyback off that. First of all, I apologize for my dog. My kids kept her away for as long as they could. But second of all, we also have to remember that sometimes we're the only people that our students can ask those questions to. So there's a certain, you know, everything Kate has said is spot on, but, you know, when we draw that line, we do have to remember that they might not be able to ask those questions at home. And we keep coming back to this issue of intersectionality. You know, we might have kids who have been told at home that culturally or religiously, it's simply just not allowed to identify as part of the community. And so they might have questions, they might be sorting things out, they might not understand. And so they're looking to you to help them with that. So when we do draw that line, we have to make sure that we're doing it in a way that we're also still supporting our kids, because they might, again, this might be the only place that they can say, hey, I don't understand that, or what's this about, or why is that bad, or why is this okay? And that's, we wear so many hats as teachers. This is, not an easy job, despite what anybody says.
Great, thank you both so much. There are about 5 questions that deal with elementary school. I know you both said that you're high school educators. I'll share them with you, and maybe you have some insight, or you have some colleagues or resources available.
Yep.
So, how can we introduce acceptance in LGBTQ topics in elementary settings? What can we do to help students that are unfamiliar with this in the elementary school setting? How do we approach parents of elementary school students? Is there something that we just should not share? Or it said, actually, what does it say? Is there something that is off the table when we teach elementary school students? So these are the types of elementary questions that we're getting.
So I will jump in about this. It's like, you can't do algebra without basic math, right? Like, you have to have a foundation for every kind of learning that happens. And I work very closely with a woman who's been writing curriculum, has created a number of elementary school curriculums that are used in central New Jersey primarily, called It's Okay to Be Different. Lorraine Gaunt has been doing this for 40 some years. And she's actually been working a little bit with our team as well. And we're hoping to bring her curriculum into the fold. It's a true curriculum. It's mapped over top of specific early education and elementary grades. And her approach is one that I respond to very positively. I feel very good about, because it's all based on empathy. It is the foundation of how we model positive relationships with human beings, how we come to know them, even if they are different than us, and how that helps us approach other people that we meet throughout our lives. And I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but the primary focus is that, it is literature based in sort of a centers kind of way. There's reading, and there's work on some language. She introduces disability, race, and ethnicity. And there's a middle school portion that's 6th, 7th, 8th grade that's LGBTQ focused. And the idea is that we learn about something that we may not have come in contact with in our own community, a type of person who may not be terribly visible to us. And a great example is there's an older gentleman she had worked with for a long time who happens to be blind. And there's a book, there's a conversation, and I am greatly truncating this. This is over the course of many months, this kind of interspersed education. There is then a meeting with somebody who represents that community, who is okay being identified as a person with disabilities, or an LGBTQ person, or a person from another culture or ethnicity or religion. And that introduction to that person is actually made to the students in a way where they can ask questions, have a conversation sort of on the level. And it models a kind of empathy that the students then take with them. And we know that they do grade to grade and apply those skills of how do we ask questions? How do we learn about things that are unfamiliar in people who are not like us? And then that becomes something that's applicable when we start talking about more challenging concepts around identity as we enter the upper elementary, middle school, and high school years. I hope that's helpful.
Definitely, thank you. Allison, did you
don't have anything to add.
Okay, no, that's okay. All right, so the consensus seems to be that we have finished our questions for now. Thank you both so much for your presentations. Actually, one question is, are educators able to view your PowerPoint material after this, Kate, or parts of it? I know there were
Yep, I will send you a deck to include in the resources. I will send along, I'll add a model lesson, one model lesson to the resources, and I'll also have a few links. If you are, if you're an educator who, we have a group on Facebook called E for E, which is basically like a GSA for grown-up teachers. That's available as a private group. You guys can find us online there. Garden State Equality has a newsletter and a website you can follow. Make It Better for Youth has a newsletter and website, and you can follow us and get all sorts of pertinent information. We overlap. We're not 100% in the same space, but if you sign up for all of it, you'll be starting to get timely information about all sorts of events, opportunities, the conference, etc.
Great, thank you. Allison, any last thoughts?
No, I just thank everybody for showing up. It's amazing to me that this many people showed up for PD in the middle of everything that we're going through. And as always, it is an honor to do anything with Kate, and Jamie was also fabulous. So I just thank you for providing this platform.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kate, Allison, Jamie, everyone that attended PRISM. Thank you so much for being here this evening.